Why would you take a bedsheet to a car shoot? Well, in this video I'm going to explain why. Taking a bedsheet to photograph a car is not actually as absurd as you might think. You would only want to use it for when you're shooting the interior. What you would do is you'd put the bedsheet over the top of the car, covering the windows, and that way you can diffuse all of the light that comes through it. So if you were lighting the interior of the car from the outside using a speed light, it's going to be a very harsh light source. Speed lights are small, and what you want to do is you want to make that light source as big as possible. Not all of us have access to massive studio lights, so a bedsheet is like a ghetto studio way of doing things. You fire the light through the bedsheet from the outside of the car, thus diffusing the light and making it appear much larger than you wanted. This is a great way to get soft ambient light into the car, and if you want, you can fire some more lights through that one side, and that way you can create a bit of drama or direction. Now, that being said, I wanted to make a tutorial on how I made this image all the way by using bed sheets and speed lights. Didn't really go that way though. By the time I got into Lightroom, I was having a look through and I didn't really like what I was seeing. The interior materials of the car just didn't really suit the light. In fact, it was too diffused. So yes, it does work, but not for this case. So I will admit that I struggled with the bedsheet and speed light combination. Looking at the images inside Lightroom, I wasn't super happy with what I was getting. And luckily I had light painted the interior whilst on set as well. Now, light painting is roughly the same as what we're trying to achieve with a speed light and a bedsheet. You're just trying to make a large light source as large as you possibly can. Now, if you look at the size of the speed light, it's only this thin and about this tall, so it's not particularly large, but on a long exposure, as you move it through the frame, it gets longer and longer and longer depending on how far you move in the frame. This allows you to get a softer light source. So to light the interior, it was quite simple. I stood on the outside of the car, walking around from the front of the vehicle round to the driver's side, holding my light source aimed towards the car. This allows light to pool inside the vehicle. For any details, I held the light inside the vehicle, so it would take the center console for instance. I held the light as close as I could to the ceiling and slowly moved it towards the front of the car from the back. Now this allows me to get a nice decent amount of reflection into the center column, as well as spilling out into other pleasing areas. I did some fill light by holding the light outside of the car just behind the camera, and this on its own is pretty ugly, but it allows you to fill in those details that you may have missed with different exposures. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you guys today. We're going to walk through the different exposures inside Photoshop for this interior. So in Photoshop, this is my base exposure. Now you can see it's got a nice level of contrast to it, and it's got some decent reflections going on, and I really quite enjoyed it. The only thing I didn't really like too much was on these air vents and in the binnacle here. So I actually masked out those and used the layer before. Now it looks super dark at the moment. Don't worry, I'll bring that back in later on. So if we just disable the rest of these masks. So the aim here is really just to use the best parts from each different exposure and then paint them in where you feel necessary when building up one of these images. So this is my base. I then moved on to the door card, which you can see is primarily lighting the driver's side door card, and it has quite a bit of spill going on throughout the interior. So I masked that out just basically to include the door card and a bit of the steering wheel area and the driver's side seat. Moving on, I got into the center console. Now this is where I said that I held the light inside the car. You can actually see the white reflection from the light source itself, and I just moved it from the right of frame to the left, and this gave pretty much all I wanted for the interior center console. And again, I just masked it out, so only using the areas of the image that I wanted, and you can see what effect that has here. The Lamborghini logo above the glove compartment down here, that was held with the light basically above the seat and just slowly moving it up and down a bit just to create a little bit of a reflection on the logo itself, seeing as it is chrome and you want to bring it out. Again, I just masked that off to only include the areas that I really wanted. Then had the passenger seat area. So if I take off, turn on the mask here, you can see it's only really affecting the bolster here and the seat base. I have a dash here, and this was only really used for the two center air vents, which I wanted to retain a little bit more shape as I felt they were getting lost earlier on. I've got another copy of this one as well, which has a bit more shape going on, so I can show you where this is being used, and that's really just to blush the back of these air vents a little bit to add some nice reflections in there. Moving on, we've got a side fill here,
Now this is pretty open and in its raw form pretty ugly as well. So if we actually mask this area, you can show, I've only used it in subtle areas. If you actually look at the mask, there's very few areas that have gone to full white, and it's only really painting in the side of this center console and the Alcantara down here on the door jambs. I have another close fill as well. This one doing pretty much most of the dash work over here, and again masked in to only include, well actually I used it for the base of the seat, so not much at all on that one. I have another dash light, which I do believe I used for up here and a few other areas, so if I turn that back on, yeah, you can see it's just a tiny bit up there. And I did actually apply a curves adjustment to this one, so if we turn that on and off, yeah, it's pretty subtle in there. And then I had a generic curves for the vehicle, which is just really dropping the shadows a little bit but holding the highlights where they were. I just wanted to add a little bit more contrast. Now obviously we've got all this ugly stuff going on the outside of the vehicle. It doesn't look particularly nice, and I got rid of that by basically just masking out the car. So I created a mask by just cutting out the windows and applied that to a group where the car sits inside. Now if we turn the car off a little bit here, we can actually see this is how I built up the background. So just a solid grey and then a lighter grey just blooming in some areas down here, and when you put the car on top like that, it creates this like sort of faux studio appeal, and I quite like that. The only thing that I felt was missing from this is, of course, we've got all these lovely buttons down here and we need to turn them on. So if we turn on the lights group, we've got a layer mask, a layer here. Now it looks super blurry, and well, that's because it is. What I did is actually I had one of the exposures for all the buttons, and what I like to do is blur that a little bit and set it to lighten, so this acts as like the sort of glow that comes from the lights. And now I've masked this out by just painting in certain areas that I wanted to use. And then we actually have the lights layer itself, and this is just like to burn in. I set it to color dodge, so it gives a bit more of a burn and retains the color rather than just going to pure white. And I will admit it doesn't look super great up close. If we turn off the blur one underneath, you can see it's very subtle, but from 100% you really want to be able to see those details, so that's why it's a little bit messy and a little bit too bright. Obviously the binnacle here looks a bit rubbish, so I added another lights pass in and just set that to normal mode, and that one just replaces the binnacle there. So there you have it. Not too much work involved really, just painting in the parts that you want. And don't be afraid if you're lighting something like this to just light certain areas. If you can't get it in one, that's totally fine. Just go through and light different areas of the car, and then you can just combine them all in Photoshop. After this, I then took it into Lightroom and gave it a little couple of tweaks just to get the final result. So here you can see is the final image inside Lightroom, and this is what it was outside of Photoshop. So a pretty dramatic change, but what I was doing basically is reducing the highlights, lifting the shadows a little bit more, and dialing in some clarity, playing around with the vibrance and saturation a little bit. But what I've done, which is quite obvious, is pushed a little bit more blue into it. I kind of like my interior shots to look a little blue, give that sort of studio feel, and I feel it kind of matches the aggression of the Lamborghini itself. So I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out.
So I hope you found that useful and there's some interesting tips and tricks in there for you. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you guys have used this technique before. Have you used a bedsheet and a speed light to similar effects? I'd love to see some examples because I really want to try it again. But I thought I'd round out this video by reading some questions that I got over Instagram. So Paul Rally 86 asked on Instagram, "Be great to hear the backstory of how you came to shoot cars." Well, for me, like, I've always loved cars. I didn't really own my own digital camera until quite late in life. When I first started going out with my wife, she started a fashion blog for her master's degree and she needed someone to take photographs. So I started doing that, and as soon as I realised that I really quite enjoyed doing this, I bought a film camera because I wanted to learn the basics. I wanted to learn everything from how to expose correctly, what ISO means, what your aperture means, etc, etc. So I bought a load of film kit and spent about a year shooting that before buying my own DSLR, which is a Canon 50D. After that, it was basically one of those like, well, I like photography and I like cars. why haven't I done the same? So I started shooting cars, and when I moved to London, I found a drift event that was local to me, and I went and photographed that, which is how I met the guys from Fieldtopia, which is what introduced me into shooting more and more cars and motorsport events. So that's basically how I got into that. SJP Photography wants to know what the focal length, exposure and ISO settings were for the interior. Well, the focal length was a 24mm f2.8 IS USM lens from Canon. ISO was 200 and the shutter speed was around 12 seconds, I do believe, and it was shot at f8. Johnny Pierce wants to know what the focal length of the lens was. Well, as mentioned previously, it's 24mm for the interior. It's not quite wide enough, but you know, if you have the tripod on the outside of the car, and you can find a nice angle. So 24 was a happy medium. I wish I had something wider. I would have liked to have gone a little bit more extreme. Something like a 16 to 35 would have been ideal to use for that. Daily Dose 27 asks, how did you get the light to be so natural and soft inside the cabin? Now, that's a good question, and that's exactly what we were talking about here. There's two ways of doing it. You can use a bed sheet and speed lights, or you can light paint. And as mentioned, the larger the light source, the softer it is. The smaller the light source, the harder it is. So the ultimate goal when shooting interiors is to have nice wide lighting, so as broad as you can get it and as controllable as you can have it as well. And that will allow you to get that soft, smooth reflections inside the interior. It also helps that the Lamborghini has amazing materials inside the car. BCEUL photo, camera settings, light settings and direction. What was the surrounding like? So camera settings, as I mentioned, is f8 ISO 200 12 seconds. The light settings, basically full power, I think it was for that. And that was mainly because you have to shoot through some glass which is tinted anyway, so that's going to reduce the amount of light and transmission that comes through it, which is why I was also shooting at ISO 200 and not ISO 100. And as for the surroundings were basically the warehouse. So I can actually show you a few before frames in this video and show you what the surrounding area looked like. Deep Spirit Photo asks, where to start when doing the composites? Now this is a good question. How do you know what frame to start with, and how do you know where to start at all when you're photoshopping? Now for me, I like to have reference photography, that stuff that's going to inspire me, so I know which way I want the image to look at the end before I even start shooting. And I tend to shoot in that order, so I kind of look at the image and then break it down into the components that I need in order to achieve that final result. So I knew exactly what I wanted to do in terms of that. So when you get into Photoshop, you basically start layering on the different lights. You don't want to light arbitrarily and just go around like lighting all over the place, because you want to do it methodically, and that's the way I shoot. I like to shoot methodically. Typically you want to look at what your key light is. So that's the main light source. What you believe you've got in your exposures is going to be the main light. That's where you always want to start from, and then you look at it and then you work out what it needs next. So for this, I started with the rim light, the one that I walked around the front of the car and down the side of the car with. That was my key light source. Then I looked at the image, I thought, well, it needs more light on the center console, and that's why I used that exposure next. Then it was like finding out details, adding in fill, and then finally putting on the LED lights inside the car. So basically you train your eye to be able to look at an image and work out what is missing from it, and then you need to shoot accordingly to make sure you have all of those passes when it comes to Photoshop. So that's a good question, I enjoyed that one. Okay, how do you decide to light something? This is kind of relevant to the question by Deep Spirit Photo as well. You kind of have to have an idea in your mind about what you want to shoot and how that's going to look, and then you kind of reverse engineer it and work towards it. So for me, I love to have reference imagery. I'm inspired by loads of different photographers. I'm not setting out to copy their style, but I like to try and work out how they were done. So basically I always try and have an image in my own mind's eye of what I want to shoot and how I want to achieve that, and then basically I go through the steps as mentioned before in achieving that, and that way when you get it into Photoshop you can stack them all together and it's basically just putting in the right layers in the right places. It doesn't really matter which order they go in Photoshop. I just like to start with my first light, second light, third light, etc, etc, and that way you can build up the image and you can get an image the way you want it to look. So thank you so much for your questions on Instagram, I really appreciate it. Do keep them coming, because at the end of each video I want to answer as many questions as I can. Now it doesn't have to be about the shot that I'm talking about, it can be anything in general, photography related, editing related, or really if life related if you want that, but I wouldn't. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you guys in the next one.